My name is Daniel, and this happened to me in early fall of 2024, just a few months after I got married. My wife and I had finally managed to buy our first house in Kokomo, Indiana, after saving for years. It was a very quiet residential neighborhood with wide streets, old trees, and nearly identical houses, each separated by low wooden fences. We both liked the area because it felt safe. There were families with children, retirees walking their dogs, and neighbors who always greeted each other whenever they met on the sidewalk. My wife worked as a physical therapist at a local hospital and occasionally worked overnight shifts on weekends. That night she was at work, so I was home alone with our dog, a Labrador named Max. I spent most of the evening assembling furniture that we still hadn't finished setting up after moving in. It was already past 11:30 when I decided to take Max into the backyard before going to bed. Since he liked chasing squirrels early in the morning, I usually left him outside for a few minutes on the long lead attached to a metal stake near the back porch. It was something I did almost every night, and nothing unusual had ever happened. As soon as I opened the back door, I felt the crisp, cool air that always came with autumn nights. The neighborhood was completely quiet. The only sounds were a few crickets and, far in the distance, the whistle of a train passing through town. I turned on the porch light while Max wandered across the yard, sniffing everything around him. As I bent down to clip the lead onto the metal anchor, I happened to glance toward the fence separating my backyard from the neighboring property. That's when I saw a man standing on the other side. It was my neighbor, who had introduced himself a few days after we moved in. I only knew him from exchanging greetings whenever we left for work. He looked to be in his early 50s, lived alone, and had always seemed very polite. That night, though, there was something strange about the way he stood. He remained perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides, staring directly at my house, not at me. When he realized I had noticed him, he slowly turned his head toward me, gave me a small smile, and simply said, "Good evening." I automatically replied and asked if everything was okay. He kept smiling for a few more seconds, answered that everything was fine, turned around, and slowly walked away until he disappeared into the dark part of his own backyard. I thought his behavior was a little odd, but I assumed he was just enjoying the cool evening air before going to bed. I went back inside, locked the back door, and headed to the kitchen to get a glass of water before bed. Max stayed outside on the lead, wandering around the yard the way he always did for a few minutes before I brought him back inside. As I filled my glass, I kept thinking about that encounter. What bothered me wasn't the fact that my neighbor had been outside at that hour. Plenty of people enjoy stepping outside before bed. What felt strange was that when I opened the door, he had already been standing there staring at my house long enough that he didn't even notice me right away. I also found it odd that he had barely looked at me during our brief conversation. It felt as though his attention had remained fixed on the house the entire time. I tried to brush the thought aside because we were still settling into the neighborhood, and I didn't want to become suspicious of someone who might simply be reserved. About 5 minutes later, I heard Max let out a short bark. It wasn't an aggressive bark, it was the sound he made whenever he noticed movement nearby. I walked toward the back door to call him inside, but before opening it, I decided to look through the small window beside the door, which overlooked almost the entire backyard illuminated by the porch light. The moment I looked outside, my stomach tightened. The same neighbor was standing inside my backyard. He was no longer behind the fence. He stood completely still just a few yards from the back door, between the porch and the lawn, staring directly at the house. Max wasn't barking at him anymore. The dog stood quietly beside the lead, watching the man without approaching him or pulling on the leash. For several seconds, I simply stared in disbelief. My first thought was that maybe he had come into the yard to tell me something urgent, but if that had been the case, he could have simply knocked on the door or called my name. Instead, he stood there in complete silence. I quietly stepped back and continued watching through the gap in the curtain. Then he took a small step toward the back door and slightly tilted his head, as though he were trying to hear movement from inside the house. At that moment, I had the unmistakable feeling that he hadn't expected me to be watching through the window. It seemed like he had been waiting for someone to open the door. My first instinct was to open the door and ask what he was doing in my backyard. Thankfully, I didn't. Instead, I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter and kept watching through the window. The man showed no sense of urgency. He remained standing in exactly the same spot, staring at the door as though waiting for movement from inside. Max, who normally barked at any stranger, stayed completely silent. His body was rigid, his ears raised, but he refused to move toward the man. That made me even more uncomfortable. I quietly called my wife, more out of instinct than because she could actually help. She didn't answer because she was still at work. I continued watching the yard, and after nearly a full minute without anything changing, the man finally raised one of his hands. For a moment, I thought he was about to knock on the glass door. Instead, he simply placed his hand on the outside handle and slowly turned it, testing whether it was unlocked. My heart started pounding immediately. The door didn't open because I had locked it only a few minutes earlier. He let go of the handle right away and remained standing there for several more seconds without saying a single word. That was the moment I decided to call 911. While speaking quietly with the dispatcher, I kept watching through the window. I explained that there was a man in my backyard trying to open the back door. She instructed me to stay inside, keep every door locked, and avoid confronting anyone. Less than 30 seconds after I finished explaining the situation, the man seemed to notice something. He slowly turned toward the window where I was hiding behind the curtain. I'm almost certain he couldn't actually see me because the lights inside the house were off, but it felt as though he knew exactly where I was. Then, without any sense of urgency, he turned around and walked toward the low fence separating our yards. Instead of heading for the side gate, he simply placed both hands on the wooden fence and climbed over it in a single smooth motion, disappearing into the darkness among the trees at the back of his property. I still didn't open the door. A few minutes later, I heard sirens approaching down the street. While waiting for the officers to arrive, I walked to another window to see whether he had gone back inside his own house. Every light in the neighboring house remained off, as though no one was home that night. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes and first conducted a quick search of my backyard. I showed them exactly where the man had been standing and where he had placed his hand on the handle of my back door. Then one of the officers walked over to the neighboring house and knocked several times on the front door. After nearly a minute, my neighbor answered wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking as though he had just woken up. He seemed perfectly calm and asked what was going on. The officers explained that I had reported seeing him inside my backyard attempting to open my back door. The man smiled politely and replied that such a thing was impossible because he had been watching television all evening and hadn't left his house once. As they spoke, I discreetly glanced at the shoes sitting near his front entrance. They were work boots covered with damp dirt, exactly like the footprints I had noticed near my back porch. One of the officers asked for permission to briefly inspect his backyard. My neighbor agreed without showing the slightest concern. They found nothing that conclusively proved he had entered my property, but they did discover fresh footprints in the dirt near the fence on both his side and mine. Since the fence was low and there were no security cameras, there was no definitive proof that he had actually climbed over it. The officers documented the incident and advised me to install motion-activated lighting and security cameras covering the backyard. The next day, I bought 2 security cameras and installed one pointing directly at the back door and the fence between our properties. My wife came home that afternoon and was just as disturbed as I was after hearing the whole story. Over the following weeks, we never again saw our neighbor inside our yard, but he also never greeted us again. Whenever we happened to cross paths, he would simply look away and quickly go back inside his house. A few months later, while talking with another resident on our street, we learned that he had already received complaints from previous neighbors because he repeatedly appeared in their backyards during the middle of the night, claiming he was checking on strange noises. He was never arrested because no one could ever prove that he had actually attempted to break into a home. We continued living in that house for a while longer, but we never again left the backyard unlit after dark, and we always locked the back door as soon as the sun went down. What still gives me chills whenever I think about that night isn't the fact that he climbed over the fence. It's remembering the way he stood in front of the back door, perfectly motionless, without knocking, without calling my name, and with absolutely no reason to be there. If I had impulsively opened the door to ask what he wanted, I still don't know how that conversation would have ended. Story 2. My name is Emily Carter, and this happened to me in September of 2024 when I was 27 years old. At the time, I had just accepted a job as a history teacher at a public school in Delaware, Ohio. A small town where it seemed like everyone had known each other since childhood. Since the school was far from the apartment where I had been living, I decided to rent a small townhouse in an older neighborhood filled with narrow streets, huge trees, and houses that had been built decades earlier. The landlord assured me it was one of the quietest neighborhoods in town. During my first few days there, I saw neighbors chatting on the sidewalks, children riding bicycles, and people walking their dogs in the late afternoon. It looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Since I was still settling in, I spent my first day carrying boxes, assembling furniture, and trying to make the house at least somewhat livable. My parents lived nearly 3 hours away, so that first night I was completely alone. I was exhausted but also excited to finally begin a new chapter of my life in a place that seemed so welcoming. After unpacking the essentials, I made myself a quick sandwich and sat down in the living room to relax for a while. The front window looked directly onto the street and at another townhouse directly across from mine. It was already past 10 o'clock at night when I started noticing something unusual. Every house on the street was almost completely dark except for that one. Every light inside it was on at the same time. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, and even one of the upstairs bedrooms were brightly lit. At first, I assumed someone else had just moved in or was doing some kind of renovation. I kept glancing over every now and then while watching television, but I never saw anyone walk past the windows. No shadows, no doors opening, no cars pulling into the driveway. Around 11:30, I turned off the television and went to close the living room curtains before going to bed. That was when I looked one more time toward the house across the street. Behind the partially closed curtain stood a silhouette. It was clearly a person standing perfectly still, facing directly toward my front window. I couldn't make out the face because of the light behind them, but I had the distinct impression that they had been standing there for a long time, silently watching the inside of my house. I stood there holding the curtain for several seconds, trying to decide whether it was actually a person or just some strange effect created by the lighting inside the house. I tilted my head slightly to change the angle, but the silhouette remained exactly where it was. It didn't move at all. I wondered if it might be a coat rack, a hanging jacket, or even a tall plant near the window. To convince myself, I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, and before heading to my bedroom, I looked through the living room window again. The silhouette was still there. What began bothering me was that absolutely nothing else seemed to be happening inside that house. There was no television on, no one walking through the rooms, no doors opening or closing. Just every light switched on and that figure standing motionless behind the curtain. I decided I was simply too tired to start feeding my imagination on my very first night there. I completely closed the living room blinds, then the kitchen blinds, and finally the bedroom blinds. Before turning off the lights, I made sure the front door was locked. I even remember thinking that by the next morning I would probably discover there was a perfectly normal explanation for everything. I had barely finished turning off the last light in the living room when I heard 3 gentle knocks at the front door. They weren't loud or urgent. They sounded polite, like someone trying to get a resident's attention without disturbing the neighbors. I instinctively looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 11:48 p.m. I thought it was strange for someone to show up that late, especially since I didn't know anyone in town besides the school principal. I remained silent, hoping whoever it was would leave, but about 20 seconds later I heard 2 more knocks in exactly the same rhythm. I slowly walked toward the door without turning on the porch light. The house was completely dark and all I could hear was my own breathing. I leaned toward the peephole and looked outside. There was a man standing alone on my front porch. I immediately recognized the dark clothing and the same posture as the silhouette I had seen standing behind the window of the house across the street just a few minutes earlier. He remained perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides. The strangest part was that he wasn't looking toward the peephole or even the doorbell. His eyes were fixed directly on the lock of my front door, as though he were waiting for it to turn at any moment. I stood there looking through the peephole for several seconds, unable to understand what was happening. The man didn't appear nervous, drunk, or lost. He simply stood there staring at the lock with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. I waited for him to raise his hand and knock again or ring the doorbell, but he never did. I reached into the pocket of my hoodie for my phone and considered asking who he was through the closed door. Before I could gather the courage to say anything, He slowly tilted his head to one side, as though trying to hear some sound coming from inside the house. Instinctively, I stepped backward and remained completely silent. After nearly a full minute, he finally raised one of his hands. My heart immediately started racing because I thought he was about to knock again. Instead, he simply brought his fingers close to the doorknob without touching it. He stared at the lock for several more seconds before slowly turning around and walking down the 3 porch steps without ever looking back. I hurried to the living room window, pulling back only a small corner of the blind so I wouldn't be seen. The man calmly crossed the street and entered the house directly across from mine. The front door closed behind him, and only a few seconds later I could once again see the same silhouette standing behind the curtain in exactly the same position where it had been before he came to my front door. At that point, I decided it couldn't simply be a coincidence. I called the local police department's emergency number and explained exactly what had just happened. While waiting for an officer to arrive, I continued discreetly watching the house across the street. The figure remained completely motionless behind the curtain. About 10 minutes later, 2 police officers pulled onto the street without using their sirens. One of them came to my house to hear my statement, while the other crossed the street and knocked on the front door of the house opposite mine. I waited for a few moments until the door finally opened. A man stepped outside to speak with the officers. Even from a distance, I immediately recognized him as the same man who had been standing on my porch only minutes earlier. They talked for several minutes before one of the officers returned to speak with me. He explained that the man had lived alone in that house for many years, and claimed he had only gone over to welcome me to the neighborhood, but decided not to knock again when he realized no one was answering the door. His explanation sounded reasonable, but it still didn't answer the question that kept running through my mind. If he truly believed I wasn't home, why had he spent so long silently staring at my front door lock without calling my name, ringing the doorbell or saying a single word? The next morning, I went to school trying to convince myself that it had all been nothing more than an awkward first encounter with a socially awkward neighbor. During lunch break, I briefly told another teacher who lived in the same neighborhood what had happened. As soon as I mentioned my address, she fell silent for several seconds before asking whether the house across the street still kept every light on at night. I told her it did. She said that was common, and that many residents had talked about the man for years. According to her, he rarely left the house during the day, and often spent hours watching the street through his front window. Some people believed he had developed severe anxiety after his wife passed away, while others said he simply didn't like interacting with anyone. However, no one had ever mentioned that he showed up at people's front doors in the middle of the night. I returned home that afternoon still thinking about the conversation. Before I even went inside, I installed a security camera I had purchased during my lunch break, positioning it to face the front porch. I also left the porch light on and closed every blind before it got dark. I spent the rest of the evening trying to act normally, but I caught myself glancing toward the house across the street every few minutes. Shortly after 11 that night, I received a motion alert from the camera on my front porch. I immediately opened the app on my phone. The man was standing in front of my door again. This time, he didn't even knock. He slowly approached, spent several seconds staring at the lock, and then quietly turned his head toward the camera. He remained standing there for less than 10 seconds before walking back to the sidewalk, crossing the street and disappearing into his own house. The following day, I gave the recording to the police. A few days later, one of the officers contacted me to say they had spoken with the man again, as well as several members of his family. They discovered that he had been suffering from severe episodes of mental confusion, and sometimes genuinely believed he still lived in the house I had just moved into. According to his family, he would occasionally leave his house during the night convinced that he needed to return home, but by the next morning, he had little or no memory of what he had done. They arranged medical treatment for him, and only a few weeks later he moved to another city to live with his brother. He never returned to the neighborhood. I still think about that first night whenever I remember that house. What frightened me the most wasn't discovering who that man was. It was realizing that while I was trying to understand why a stranger was watching my house, he was probably genuinely convinced, in his confused state of mind, that I was the one living inside his home. Story 3. My name is Kayla Bennett, and this happened to me during the summer of 2023 when I was 16 years old. My parents both worked at a supermarket in the Bloomington, Indiana area, and during summer break, I usually spent most of the week home alone. They left early in the day and on some nights didn't get back until close to midnight because of the store's closing shift and the drive home. Our house was located at the end of a dead-end street in a small cul-de-sac with only 8 houses. It was a very quiet neighborhood. Kids usually played in the street during the afternoon, and once it got dark, there was almost no activity at all. I enjoyed being home alone. I'd make popcorn, watch TV shows, chat with my friends on my phone, and wait for my parents to get home. They always insisted that I keep every door locked and never open the door to strangers. Since the neighborhood was considered safe, I never really thought those warnings were necessary. Until that night. That day, my parents left around 2 in the afternoon and told me they probably wouldn't be home until close to midnight. I spent the rest of the afternoon watching television and organizing a few things in my bedroom. As it started getting dark around 7 in the evening, I went into the kitchen to make something to eat. While I was waiting for the microwave, I looked out the front window and noticed a white pickup truck parked across the street near the small turnaround at the end of the cul-de-sac. I didn't recognize it as belonging to any of the neighbors, but I assumed it was someone visiting. What struck me as odd was that the driver remained inside the truck without getting out. The headlights were off, but the engine seemed to still be running because every now and then I could see a faint vibration in the parking lights and hear a low engine noise whenever everything around the neighborhood became quiet. I kept watching for a few seconds, expecting someone to come out of one of the neighboring houses to greet whoever it was. That never happened. After nearly half an hour, the truck was still parked in exactly the same spot, with the driver still sitting behind the wheel. I kept glancing out the window from time to time while watching television. The pickup truck never moved. I couldn't make out the driver's face because the windshield reflected the streetlights, but I could clearly tell that someone was sitting behind the wheel. Every so often, I noticed a faint bluish glow inside the cab, as though the driver were looking at a cell phone. Other times, the light disappeared completely, and the person remained perfectly still again. The whole thing seemed increasingly strange because by that hour, almost every neighbor was already home. I saw 2 families return from work, a couple walking their dog, and even a delivery driver dropping off a package at another house. Nobody seemed to know the driver or approach the truck. I even texted my mom to tell her there had been a vehicle sitting out in front of the street for a long time. She replied almost immediately, telling me to keep the house locked and not go outside for any reason until they got home. She said it was probably someone waiting for another person, but asked me to let her know if anything unusual happened. I decided to follow her advice. I closed all the curtains at the front of the house and began watching discreetly through a small gap in the living room blinds. The hours passed and the truck remained there. It was already after 10 o'clock at night when I began feeling a sense of uneasiness that was hard to explain. It wasn't just the fact that the truck had been parked there for so long. What bothered me was that the driver never seemed to have any intention of leaving. At one point, I went upstairs and looked out my bedroom window, which gave me a better view of the street. From there, I realized the truck was positioned almost directly in front of my house. It wasn't a perfect angle, but whoever was inside could easily watch my front door and most of the front of the house. I stood there watching for several minutes and had the impression that the driver slightly turned his head toward my window. I instinctively stepped away from the glass. My heart immediately started racing, even though I wasn't sure whether he had actually seen me. Shortly before 11, I tried distracting myself by watching a movie, but every few minutes I got up to check whether the truck was still there. It remained in exactly the same spot where it had been since early evening, with the engine running and no one entering or leaving the vehicle. Around 11:50 p.m., I decided to look one more time through the gap in the blinds. The truck was gone. I felt relieved for a few seconds, assuming the driver had finally left. I kept watching the street for nearly a full minute, and there wasn't a single vehicle driving by. It was exactly as I stepped away from the window that I heard a faint metallic sound coming from the side of the house. Our house had a narrow gate that led to the backyard. The noise was extremely subtle, like someone carefully trying the handle without making much sound. I immediately held my breath. A few seconds later, I heard the same sound again, followed by a soft metallic click. It didn't sound like someone trying to come in normally. It sounded like someone testing whether the gate was unlocked. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He answered immediately. I quietly told him what I was hearing. and before I could even finish my sentence, he told me to lock my bedroom door, keep every light off, and call the police immediately. While I was making the call, I heard someone try the gate handle again, this time for a little longer, as though they were trying to figure out whether there was some kind of lock securing it. The next few minutes felt much longer than they actually were. I stayed kneeling beside my bed, speaking quietly with the police dispatcher, while my father drove home as fast as he could. The dispatcher told me not to go near the windows and to keep listening for any movement outside. About a minute later, I heard footsteps along the narrow concrete walkway beside the house. They were slow and deliberate, as though whoever it was trying not to make any noise. A moment later, I heard the gate close again with a soft click. The dispatcher told me to stay exactly where I was because a patrol car was already very close. Less than 3 minutes later, I saw the reflection of the police lights illuminating the street through my bedroom window. As soon as the patrol car entered the cul-de-sac, I heard an engine suddenly accelerate hard from the corner of the main road, outside my field of view. The officers searched the neighborhood but didn't find anyone. One of them walked over to the side gate and noticed fresh tool marks near the latch, as though someone had tried unsuccessfully to force it open. Later that same night, one of our neighbors showed the officers footage from the security camera mounted on his garage. Just before midnight, the same white pickup truck was seen slowly leaving the cul-de-sac. Less than 30 seconds later, a man dressed in dark clothing appeared walking along the sidewalk toward the side of my house. He had parked the truck far enough away to make me believe he had left and then returned on foot. Waiting for the exact moment he thought I would let my guard down, the police spent nearly an hour searching the surrounding area, but the pickup truck was never located again that night. My parents arrived only a few minutes after the patrol car and were just as frightened as I was. The following day, a detective came back to speak with us and collected security footage from several neighbors. One camera captured only part of the truck entering the street hours earlier. Another recorded the man walking toward the side gate, but the lighting was too poor to identify either his face or the truck's license plate. While we were talking outside, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses away overheard our conversation and decided to tell us something she had never mentioned before. About 2 months earlier, she had also seen a white pickup truck parked in the same cul-de-sac for an entire night. At the time, she assumed someone was waiting for one of the residents and didn't think much of it. The following morning, however, she found her backyard gate partially open, even though she was certain she had locked it before going to bed. Since nothing had been stolen, she never reported the incident. That led the police to believe the man might have been selecting homes where he knew only one person was alone at night, watching the routine for hours before quietly attempting to approach without attracting attention. After that incident, my parents installed security cameras all around the house, reinforced the gates, and replaced every lock. I was never left home alone at night again while they worked late shifts. A few weeks later, the police contacted us to say they had received similar reports from nearby neighborhoods, all involving a white pickup truck parked for long periods on quiet residential streets, followed by discreet attempts to gain access to backyard gates. They were never able to prove it was the same person or identify the driver. To this day, I still don't know what that man's intentions were. Maybe he was simply looking for an opportunity to break into an empty house. Maybe he realized a teenage girl was home alone and patiently waited for the moment he believed I would let my guard down. What I have never been able to forget is the way everything unfolded. For hours, I believed the danger was sitting inside that pickup truck parked across the street. In reality, the truck was only part of the plan. The real danger began the moment it disappeared from my sight. Story 4. My name is Caleb, and this happened to me in July of 2024 when I was 21 years old. I was studying mechanical engineering at Penn State University, but during summer break I usually returned to my parents' house in a residential neighborhood in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was an extremely quiet place made up of wide streets, old trees, and houses that looked almost identical. Most of the residents had lived there for decades, and everyone seemed to know one another. My parents worked during the day, so I spent much of my vacation home alone, taking the opportunity to rest, go running in the late afternoon, and catch up on my studies before the next semester. I had never had any reason to worry about safety in that neighborhood. People left bicycles on their porches, tools in their yards, and even delivery packages sat outside doors for hours without disappearing. It was exactly the kind of place where you would never expect to find someone behaving strangely. That night, my parents had gone to dinner at some friend's house and told me they would not be back until around 11. Shortly after 9, I remembered that the garbage truck would come early the next morning. I grabbed 2 large bags from the kitchen and went outside to place them beside the curb, where all the neighbors left theirs. As soon as I crossed the front yard, I noticed a man a short distance ahead. He was walking slowly from one trash can to another, bending down beside the garbage bags left along the curb. At first, I assumed he was collecting cans or recyclable materials, something that happened occasionally. But after watching him for only a few seconds, I realized that was not what he was doing. He carefully opened each bag, removed a few objects, examined them one by one under the streetlights, and then placed them back exactly as they had been before closing the bag again. He did not seem to be searching for food, money, or anything valuable. He seemed to be looking for something very specific. When I finished placing my bags on the ground, he raised his head and looked directly at me. We stared at each other in silence for several seconds. Without saying a single word, he closed the bag he had been examining, turned his back, and calmly walked away down the street until he disappeared around the corner. I stood there watching until he disappeared around the corner, trying to understand what I had just seen. The strangest part was not that someone was going through the neighbor's trash, but the way he was doing it. There was no urgency, no disorder, and no attempt to hide what he was doing. He opened the bags carefully, examined certain objects for a few seconds, and placed them back in exactly the same position before moving on to the next house. I went back inside, locked the door, and sent my father a message asking whether anyone usually collected recyclables in the neighborhood at night. He replied a few minutes later saying he had never seen anyone doing that, and asked why I wanted to know. I quickly told him what had happened. He told me to keep the house locked and said he would come home as soon as dinner was over. I decided not to think about it anymore. I took a shower, made myself a snack, and went to watch a baseball game on television. Even so, from time to time, I caught myself looking out the living room window to see whether the man had returned. It was already after 10:30 when I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. The kitchen window had a direct view of the trash can beside the garage. As I filled the glass, I casually looked outside and immediately felt a chill in my stomach. The same man was standing directly in front of our trash can. This time, he was not searching through any bags. He stood completely still, holding an old photograph in both hands. It took me a few seconds to recognize the image, but then I realized it was a picture of my family taken many years earlier, when I was still a child. My mother had spent the afternoon cleaning out some old boxes from the attic and had mentioned throwing away several duplicate photographs and damaged albums. The man held one of those photographs at chest level while silently staring at our house. He was not looking at the photograph. He was not looking at the street. His eyes remained fixed on the kitchen windows as though he were trying to determine whether anyone was watching from inside. I remained completely still behind the wall, breathing as slowly as possible without even daring to turn on the outside light. My first instinct was to grab my phone and take a picture of him through the window, but I immediately changed my mind out of fear that the glow from the screen would reveal my position. I continued watching only through a small gap between the curtain and the wall. The man remained motionless for nearly a full minute, still holding the photograph. Then he slowly lowered his eyes to the image, ran his thumb across it as though wiping away some dirt, and looked back at the house. That gave me a much worse feeling than if he had been trying to break into a door. It looked like he was comparing the faces in the photograph with the house in front of him. I immediately called my father and quietly told him what was happening. Before I could even finish, he told me to lock every door and call the police. While making the call, I continued watching the man through the window. A few seconds later, he carefully folded the photograph, placed it in his jacket pocket, and opened one of the garbage bags again. This time, he removed several more papers, glanced at them quickly, and returned them to the bag before closing it again. Then he calmly walked down the sidewalk until he disappeared in the same direction he had gone earlier. The patrol car arrived about 8 minutes later. My parents showed up at almost the same time. I told the officers exactly what I had seen and showed them the trash can the man had searched through. One of the officers found the bags closed again, but noticed that several of them had been opened and tied differently from the way we normally did it. My mother confirmed that the photograph had indeed been thrown away that afternoon along with other old boxes. While we were talking in the garage, a neighbor crossed the street and said he had also seen the same man examining garbage bags in the neighborhood a few weeks earlier, but assumed he was looking for recyclable materials. No one had called the police because he had never tried to enter any houses or taken anything valuable. The officers collected the photograph he had dropped a few yards farther down the sidewalk while fleeing, and advised all the residents to destroy personal documents before throwing them away. Even so, one question remained unanswered. If his only goal was to obtain information, why had he stood there for so long staring directly at our house before leaving? The following morning, a detective returned to our house to gather more information. He asked exactly what items my mother had thrown away the previous day. She explained that she had been cleaning out old boxes from the attic and had discarded duplicate photographs, birthday cards, old envelopes, and some paperwork from a move our family had made many years earlier. The officer explained that although it seemed strange, criminals sometimes searched through trash for personal information before choosing a home to break into. Photographs could reveal how many people lived in the house, the approximate ages of the residents, or even whether there were children or elderly people. Old mail could confirm full names, and packaging from expensive products could suggest what might be inside the home. That explanation made sense, but it did not erase the detail that bothered me the most. I could not forget the way that man stood there holding my family photograph while silently watching our house. He did not look like someone merely searching for information. He looked like someone trying to confirm that he had found the right house. During the following weeks, no other incident occurred, but a few days later, the police informed the residents that they had received similar reports in nearby neighborhoods around Lancaster. In every case, witnesses described a man walking at night, carefully opening residential garbage bags and examining photographs, mail, and documents before putting them back where he found them. They were never able to identify him or prove that he was connected to any specific crime, although several burglary victims in other cities had reported similar behavior before their homes were broken into. My parents began shredding all mail and tearing up old photographs before throwing them away. I also completely changed the way I viewed something as simple as placing the trash by the curb. Until then, I had always thought that garbage stopped being important the moment it left our house. That night, I learned that to someone with bad intentions, it could reveal far more about a family than any conversation with a neighbor. And sometimes all a stranger needs is a few minutes alone beside a trash can to decide which house he is going to watch next. Story 5. My name is Noah, and this happened to me in the fall of 2024 when I was 31 years old. My wife, Hannah, and I had just moved into a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Lexington, Kentucky, with our 3-year-old son. After spending years living in a small apartment downtown, we had finally managed to buy our first house. We chose that neighborhood specifically because of how peaceful it was. The streets were wide, there were plenty of trees, well-maintained sidewalks, and nearly every family had young children. It seemed like the perfect place to raise our son. I worked remotely as a systems analyst, while Hannah was a physical therapist and usually got home in the late afternoon. Since I spent the entire day at home, I quickly became familiar with the neighborhood's routine. I knew when the school buses came through, when the neighbors walked their dogs, and even which kids usually played in the street after school. That was exactly why one particular boy started catching my attention. He looked to be somewhere between 12 and 14 years old, and he always showed up on the same blue BMX bike without a backpack, without a helmet, and never accompanied by anyone. Every afternoon between 5 and 6 o'clock, he would ride slowly into our street. He would pass in front of our house, continue to the end of the cul-de-sac, turn around, and repeat the route several times before disappearing. At first, I assumed he simply lived nearby and was riding his bike for fun. But as the days passed, I realized there was something unusual about him. I never saw him pull into any driveway, talk to other kids, or stop in front of any house. He simply rode slowly up and down the street, always looking from side to side as though carefully observing each home. A few times I waved at him while I was mowing the lawn, but he never waved back. He just kept pedaling silently at the same steady pace until he disappeared around the corner. After nearly 2 weeks of watching the exact same routine, I started telling Hannah that the boy seemed far more interested in the houses than in riding his bike. Eventually, his presence became something we talked about regularly. Hannah said he was probably just a bored teenager enjoying the late afternoon before dinner. I tried to believe that, but there were small details that continued to bother me. Every time he passed our house, he slowed down just a little more. He never actually stopped, but he seemed to discreetly glance toward the garage, the front porch, and the front windows before continuing on. Sometimes this happened while I was outside playing with our son in the front yard. Other times it happened when the house appeared completely empty. I started paying closer attention and realized that he never rode through the neighborhood on weekends, only on weekdays. He also never showed up when it was raining. It was as though he followed a very specific schedule. Even so, there was nothing inherently suspicious about riding a bicycle through a residential neighborhood, so we eventually let the matter go. One Thursday, Hannah got home from work a little earlier than usual, and after putting our son to bed, we decided to watch a movie in the living room. It was already after 10:30 that night when she mentioned seeing someone riding a bicycle outside. I thought that was odd, because there was almost never any activity at that hour. I carefully pulled back the curtain and immediately felt my stomach tighten. It was the same boy. He was slowly riding down the middle of the completely empty street, exactly as he did every afternoon. There were no other people walking, no dogs on the sidewalks, and no one outside any of the houses. Just him, silently circling beneath the streetlights. We watched him complete another loop around the cul-de-sac before disappearing for a few seconds behind a parked pickup truck. I waited for him to reappear on the other side of the street, but he never did. I kept watching through the window until Hannah pointed toward the sidewalk in front of the neighboring house. The bicycle was lying on the ground, as though it had been dropped in a hurry. The boy, however, had simply vanished. We stood there staring through the window for several seconds, trying to find a logical explanation. The bicycle remained lying exactly where Hannah had pointed it out. There were no large trees, high fences, or parked vehicles close enough to hide someone. The street was short and ended only a few yards farther ahead at the cul-de-sac. If he had kept riding, we would have seen him. If he had gone into one of the houses, we would have seen that too. Yet the boy was simply nowhere to be found. Hannah suggested that maybe he had crashed and run off to get help, but the bicycle was still lying on the sidewalk and no one came out of any of the nearby houses. That was when we heard a sound coming from the side of our house. It was the unmistakable noise of someone slowly walking along the narrow concrete pathway that connected the front gate to the backyard. The footsteps were light, spaced apart, and deliberate, as though the person was trying to make as little noise as possible. I immediately looked at Hannah and motioned for her to stay quiet. Our son was asleep in the back bedroom, the room closest to that side walkway. I picked up my phone and walked into the kitchen, where I could see part of the side gate without opening any curtains. I kept every light off and looked outside through a small gap in the blinds. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued for a few more seconds, followed by a faint metallic click. It sounded like someone testing the latch on the gate leading into the backyard. I quietly called the police while Hannah went upstairs to our son's bedroom. The dispatcher instructed us to stay inside the house and not attempt to check outside. Less than a minute later, the footsteps stopped completely. I kept watching through the kitchen window until I finally worked up the courage to look back toward the street. The bicycle was still lying in exactly the same place. A few seconds later, however, an adult man wearing a dark hoodie calmly walked over to it. Without any sign of urgency, he picked up the bicycle, glanced briefly in both directions down the street, and then pushed it away until he disappeared around the corner. The boy never reappeared beside it. At that moment, I realized the bicycle might never have been abandoned by accident. It had most likely been left there on purpose to keep our attention focused on the front of the house while someone else approached from the back. The police arrived in less than 5 minutes and searched the entire neighborhood. One of the officers found fresh sneaker prints in the damp soil beside our side gate, but no one had managed to get into the backyard because the latch was still locked. While we were talking outside, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down came over to speak with the officers. He said he had also seen the same boy riding his bicycle through the neighborhood almost every day for several weeks. He had never thought it was unusual because he assumed the kid lived nearby. That same night, however, shortly before the police arrived, the security camera mounted above his garage had recorded something that completely changed the situation. The footage showed the boy slowly riding his bicycle toward the front of our house. He then simply let the bicycle fall onto the sidewalk and ran toward the corner of the street, where a dark SUV was parked with its lights off. He quickly got into the passenger seat and the vehicle quietly drove away. About 20 seconds later, another man appeared walking along the sidewalk toward the side passage beside our house. From the camera's angle, it was impossible to see what happened after that, but the timestamp matched exactly the moment when we heard the footsteps beside the house. The police were never able to identify the SUV or locate the boy. The footage was clear enough to show the sequence of events, but not clear enough to read the vehicle's license plate. Investigators believed the two were working together. The teenager attracted the residents' attention for days, making himself appear to be nothing more than a kid riding his bike around the neighborhood. Once everyone had grown accustomed to seeing him, they began using him to determine which houses were occupied and which homeowners reacted to his presence. That night, the bicycle left on the sidewalk served as a distraction while the other man attempted to approach the house from the backyard. After that, we installed security cameras covering the entire side of our house, reinforced the gates, and agreed that we would never again let our son sleep alone downstairs whenever one of us was away. To this day, whenever I see a child riding a bicycle back and forth along the same street over and over again, I think about that week. What appeared to be nothing more than a teenager with nothing better to do turned out to be the first step in a carefully repeated plan, carried out until someone finally let their guard down. Story 6. My name is Megan, and this happened to me in October of 2024 when I was 35 years old. I was living alone on a residential street in Springfield, Missouri, after my divorce had been finalized. The house was small, but it was located in an older, very quiet neighborhood where almost all the residents had lived for many years. Directly across from my house stood a 2-story home that had been vacant since before I moved in. The for sale sign had been rusting away in the front yard, the lawn had grown wild without maintenance, and the windows were always closed with the blinds drawn. Every now and then, a real estate agent would show up to give someone a tour of the property, but I never saw anyone buy it. As the months passed, that house simply became part of the scenery. I barely paid any attention to it anymore whenever I came home from work or left to run errands. That was why, when something finally happened there, it caught my attention immediately. It was a Saturday night, and I was home alone watching television in the living room after getting back from the grocery store. Around 9:30, I started hearing faint music, as though someone had turned on a speaker somewhere in the distance. At first, I assumed the sound was coming from a party on another street, but the volume gradually increased. I turned off the television so I could listen more carefully and realized I could hear several people talking and laughing. I walked over to the living room window and pulled back just one corner of the curtain. The abandoned house looked completely different from the way I saw it every day. Lights were on in several rooms downstairs as well as upstairs. As I watched, I saw 2 people walking down the side passage of the property toward the backyard. A moment later, 3 more appeared. None of them used the front door. Every one of them followed exactly the same path, disappearing behind the house as though they knew precisely where they were going. The strangest part was that there wasn't a single car parked in front of the house, nor was there any indication that the property had been officially occupied. I continued watching through the small opening in the curtain for several minutes. More and more people kept arriving. They came in small groups, always on foot, appearing from the corner of the street and heading straight toward the back of the house. None of them seemed to talk before entering. They simply walked quickly down the side passage and disappeared. I tried counting how many had gone in, but I lost track after the 10th person. What bothered me the most was that nobody used the front door. They all seemed to deliberately avoid the front of the house. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched for the listing online. It still showed the house as being for sale, with photographs that had been taken months earlier. There was no indication whatsoever that the property had been rented or sold. I kept watching through the window and noticed that the curtains remained closed despite all the lights being on inside. You could hear music and voices, but you could hardly ever see anyone through the windows. After a few more minutes, I began to think it might be a break-in or some kind of illegal party inside an empty property. At exactly 10 o'clock, I decided to call the police using the non-emergency number, I explained that a house that appeared to be abandoned had suddenly become active, and that several people were entering through the back without any vehicles parked on the street. The dispatcher took down the address and said an officer would be sent to check on the situation. While I waited, I continued discreetly watching through the living room window. The music was still playing, and I could still hear people talking, although no one else seemed to be arriving. About 5 minutes later, I saw a young man quickly come out through the side passage, look both ways down the street, and then head back toward the rear of the house. Immediately afterward, something happened that sent chills down my spine. Every light in the house went out at exactly the same instant. It wasn't the gradual process of someone turning off one room after another before leaving. The living room, kitchen, bedrooms, and porch all went completely dark at the same moment. The music also stopped abruptly. In less than a second, all of that activity disappeared, leaving the street in complete silence, as though there had never been any party at all. Less than 2 minutes later, a patrol car slowly entered the street with its headlights dimmed. I stayed behind the curtain, watching everything without turning on a single light inside my house. 2 officers got out and walked to the front of the vacant house. When no one answered their knocks at the door, they went around the side of the house through the very same passage where all those people had entered. I waited to hear voices, someone running, or at least somebody coming out through the back. Nothing happened. The silence remained absolute. After a few minutes, one of the officers turned on a flashlight and began shining it through the upstairs windows. There was no movement inside. A moment later, both officers disappeared into the house. Time seemed to stand still. I kept staring at the house when one of the officers reappeared in the backyard and pointed his flashlight toward the property line between our yards. Then he quickly motioned for his partner to come over. A short while later, one of the officers crossed the street and knocked on my front door. I only opened it after confirming through the window that he really was a police officer. He asked if I would accompany him to my backyard while staying beside him at all times. As soon as we reached the back of my house, he pointed his flashlight toward the ground. The soil near the fence was still damp from the rain earlier that afternoon, and there were numerous fresh sneaker prints leading in a straight line from the back door of the abandoned house to the fence separating our properties. The wooden fence stood just under 6 feet tall. At one spot, one of the boards had been pushed slightly out of place, creating a narrow opening that someone could squeeze through after forcing the wood aside. On the other side, in the backyard of the vacant house, the back door was standing wide open. The officers believed that at the exact moment the lights had gone out, everyone inside had left through the back door and crossed one after another into my backyard, using my property as an escape route before the patrol car arrived. None of them were still there by the time the officers entered the house. The officers thoroughly searched the house before leaving. Inside, they found only signs that a large number of people really had been there just minutes earlier. Plastic cups were scattered around the kitchen, cans of soda were still cold on one of the countertops, opened bags of chips were lying around, and a small portable speaker sat turned off on the living room floor. The strange part was that there was no furniture. The house remained almost completely empty, exactly as it appeared in the photographs from the real estate listing. One of the upstairs bedrooms had fresh marks on the hardwood floor where mattresses had recently been placed, but none of them were still there. According to the officers, everything suggested that the people knew the property extremely well, and also knew exactly how to escape if someone called the police. Before leaving, one of the officers recommended that I immediately replace the lock on my backyard gate and install motion-activated lights facing the yard. He also advised me to check whether anyone had hidden objects near the fence, something criminals sometimes did so they could return later. The following morning, I found only a few muddy footprints near the property line, confirming that several people really had crossed through my backyard while fleeing. A few weeks later, I learned the rest of the story while speaking with one of the investigators assigned to the case. The abandoned house had been used for months to host parties organized through messaging apps. The address was shared only a few hours before each gathering and changed constantly to make complaints more difficult. Since the property remained vacant and unmonitored, people entered through the back to avoid attracting the neighbors' attention. What I have never been able to explain is how quickly everyone disappeared. Only a few minutes passed between the moment the lights went out and the patrol car arrived, Yet dozens of people managed to leave the house without me seeing a single one of them cross the street. If the officers hadn't found the back door standing open and the footprints leading toward my backyard, I probably would have convinced myself that I had imagined the entire thing. Ever since then, whenever I look at a house that appears to be empty, I think about that night. Sometimes just because a property looks abandoned during the day doesn't mean it actually stays empty after dark.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.